Hi, I'm Rajesh Kasturirangan, and we are with our last speaker of the first ClimateX Hive, Chris Nidel, who is also one of the founders of the MIT Alumni for Climate Action Leadership. And Chris is now an environmental lawyer based in DC, but before that, he was one of the best chemical engineers in this country, or that's what I think anyway. So Chris will tell us a little bit more about himself.
So as Rajesh said, I'm a chemical engineer, graduated from MIT with a master's degree in chemical engineering in 1995. I went on to work for a pharmaceutical company at that point. That was sort of the leading industry as far as chemical engineering graduates went at the time. And they were some of the most respected and admired companies in the world. And so I went to work for one of them.
And is that what made you go into the law after that?
At least in some part, yes. I worked for a pharmaceutical company for roughly 5 years, and I graduated in 95, started with the pharmaceutical company in 96. And by the time around 2000, I had decided that the pharmaceutical industry was not, did not agree with my values with respect to the environment, number one, and with respect to human health and profits over people's health, essentially. And so I decided that, you know, I couldn't work there any longer with respect to my own values and being consistent with my own morals and ethics. And so I went to law school to pursue a career where I fought to protect the environment and to try and protect people who needed access to healthcare and life-saving medicines.
That's fantastic. So tell us a little bit about what you do now.
So I've been an environmental lawyer ever since 2003. I started with a large environmental law firm down in Texas, where we did work with Aaron Brockovich and some of the big, what they call toxic tort cases. So large environmental cases where people have been injured by exposures to chemical plants, refineries, and in some cases pharmaceuticals. And I left that firm, went to a small firm in DC, and after a year there, I started my own firm where I represent people who are exposed to all types of environmental pollutants, sewage sludge, chemicals, benzene, radiation, as well as I do some work with nonprofits representing Waterkeeper Alliance and some other nonprofits in actions to protect the environment from things like fracking and CAFOs, animal waste, and other things. And I also do some pharmaceutical litigation as well, representing people that have been exposed to dangerous drugs without knowing it and have suffered some serious impacts from those.
That seems like a pretty full plate to me. And I bet you're super busy. Do you feel happy that you have made this shift from being a chemical engineer to being a lawyer?
That's a very complex question. I certainly am happier with what I do. You know, there were things that I did professionally with my job in the pharmaceutical industry as an engineer that I really enjoyed doing. I am, you know, I think at heart a scientist, and so I enjoyed what I did. I enjoyed doing experiments. I enjoyed coming up with new ideas and improving drug process development and so on. But and I would say, quite frankly, that I don't know that the work that I do as far as writing briefs and you know, arguing with defense lawyers most of the time is enjoyable work. But in the big picture, I think that's where I get my joy. So it's not necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but when I look at what I've done over the long term and the people that I've been able to help, I think that's where I tend to appreciate the choices that I've made and where I'm at right now in my career.
So tell us maybe one thing that you've done as a lawyer that you think has really made our lives better, or at least the people who you helped.
Well, probably I mean, there's a number of examples, but the one that most often comes to mind, I represented a guy who was diagnosed with leukemia in midlife, I think in his late 30s. And he was diagnosed with leukemia. And after he was diagnosed with leukemia, he found out that the water well that he had been drinking from for several years was contaminated with radiation. And not only that, but the company that had contaminated the well with the radiation knew about the radiation, but just didn't tell him about it when they bought his property from him. And so I represented him in a case against the companies that had polluted the well. And, you know, it wasn't a huge amount of money that we ended up getting. It wasn't a huge victory in some sense, but it was something that really changed his life for the better and allowed him to do things for him and his family that he wouldn't have been able to do, especially given his illness. So, you know, that's an example. It's one person, but it's nice to see that you can have a somewhat of a life-changing impact on one person and their family's lives. And that's the kind of thing that I think motivates me to get up and do the work that I do, even though at times it can be quite depressing, quite frankly, and certainly frustrating with the system that we have.
That's fantastic. So, of course, we're here to talk about ClimateX and climate change. And I don't know much about the law, but do you see the law as an effective tool to address climate action in the direction that we want it to go?
Yeah, certainly. I think there are things both directly and indirectly that can be done within the law to advance climate protection. You know, an example could be with respect to fracking. So fracking is one of the big sources, natural gas development is one of the big sources of climate gases. So methane, which we know is significantly more of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And right now you have methanes going unregulated. It's leaking from fracking sites and fracking development areas at fairly alarming rates. And so there's a component of citizen science and people that have looked at methane emissions from these sites. And there's a legal aspect as well with respect to bringing actions that would slow natural gas development and therefore slow the impact of the methane emissions from these sites and the resulting impact on our climate. There are other avenues, perhaps more directly addressing climate issues. One of them, we see some of the litigation that's taken place with respect to climate change, with respect to state attorney generals that are going after companies like Exxon who have publicly taken a position that there's no such thing as climate change and that climate change is not something to be worried about, where their own scientists internally are saying something quite different, and their own investigations into the issue are showing that, you know, and have showed actually for decades that climate change is a real risk, and it's, you know, a direct outcome of our reliance and our consumption of fossil fuels. And so there are state actions that are taking place, and I think there's a potential there for individual actions to take place as well with respect to certain consumer protection laws and other state laws that would protect the citizens of each state from deceptive conduct on the part of companies like Exxon and BP and some of the other companies that have tried to deny climate change for the last several decades.
Wow, that's fantastic. You mentioned citizen science in the context of fracking, and since citizen science was one of the sessions in the first ClimateX Hive, do you think that there's a possibility of citizens collecting data that could be used in court or in similar advocacy circumstances?
Yeah, definitely. You know, citizen science, especially as it relates to legal actions, is again a pretty complex issue. But you know, the data that people collect, you know, the ultimate test comes down to reliability and repeatability of the tests. And if citizens are out there collecting temperature data, collecting methane data, using FLIR cameras to observe and qualify methane emissions from, for example, fracking sites, certainly that data comes into play and should should be considered by experts that are testifying in litigation and should be considered by juries and judges that are evaluating the strength of the evidence in litigation. So I definitely think there's a role for citizen science. And, the reality for a lot of the issues that really are impacting the environment right now is that there is no regulator and there is no, full-time scientist that's on site gathering this data. You have to rely on citizen scientists that are distributed in these communities and distributed in the mountains of West Virginia and Pennsylvania and in these pockets to gather the information, to establish the evidence, to make some of these cases. And so, I think not only is it important that we emphasize to the citizens that their work is important, but we emphasize to the courts and to, the judges that this kind of work is necessary to establish the impacts on our environment from some of these things like fracking.
That's fantastic. And that flow from citizen science to legal action could be something that could happen across the country in different places depending on what their needs are. So let me finish this call because there's so much here that will take hours, if not weeks, to unpack, but we don't have that much time. So do you think that your chemical engineering training, or maybe not specifically chemical engineering, but your kind of analytic training in an engineering discipline helps you be a better lawyer?
Yeah, absolutely. Being a lawyer is not something certainly that when I started as an engineer that I would have thought that I would do. That being said, I use, I would say my engineering skills on a routine basis, as well as my chemical engineering skills on a routine basis. Knowing the sort of chemistry side of things. I do a lot. I'm doing a case right now with respect to the Hanford nuclear site that's got a lot of chemical exposures. So I'm looking at chemicals and exposures and toxicology and those types of things all the time. At the same time as I'm doing a lot of things that involve engineering and mathematical modeling, environmental modeling. And so those two sets of skills, I think, come in. And even more broadly than that, I think there's certainly from MIT and even from my undergraduate training at University of Virginia, there's an element of problem solving that I think comes up whether you're dealing with negotiations between, you and another party, or whether you're dealing with, trying to solve a mass transfer problem. There are some problem solving set of skills that you develop as an engineer that show up every day in the legal world, whether it's trying to figure out how to view a large PDF and show it to a jury, or solve a modeling problem to show that your client has been exposed to some chemicals that might have made them sick. So yeah, there's a whole, in my view, there's a wealth of applications from that engineering training to my work, specifically, generally in the law, and then specifically with respect to the environmental work that I do.
That's fantastic, because as more and more people start looking at green careers as a possibility, they will be spreading beyond their basic training at MIT or wherever they go. And I think it's great to see that it's not that you lose that skill set. If anything, it's important.
Right. Yeah. You continue to apply it in new ways and hopefully in ways that will, improve our future, both specifically for us as individuals and for us as a planet.
Well, with that thought, I want to thank Chris once again, and we look forward to your Unhangout session in a few weeks. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.